Yes, 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 ladies and gentlemen. I do welcome you all to Storytime number 10. Goodness gracious, we are a little bit behind schedule, given that we were supposed to be broadcasting earlier this evening. Unfortunately, here in South Africa, where we're broadcasting from this evening, had a little bit of a problem with electricity supply, so we're streaming to you as we can. We're not going to be thwarted. We're going to keep pushing forward to bring you little stories of basically what makes the spice of life and all the mysteries around us kind of come together. That is more or less the aim of Storytime, so welcome everyone. It is a great pleasure to eventually be coming online and presenting tonight's program to you guys. Storytime 10 is going to be a special one. We're basically talking about dark politics and secret powers. It's a broad topic, but I'm going to try and filter it for you guys and bring it to more understanding. Try and basically square this picture and frame it for us. And the way we're going to do that and proceed this evening is basically, I want to have a look at the Durham Report this evening. For those of you unfamiliar with that, it's a recent report that is being looked at and has come public in the United States of America, basically implicating a huge chunk of the intelligence services and just politicians in general, and many others. So it's quite a big scandal, and I want to try and contrast that tonight with some of the previous big, deep politic, events of deep politics that have occurred in the past. So we're going to be looking at Watergate and the Pentagon Papers and the Iran-Contra, and we have time, maybe even things like a little bit of JFK and 9/11. But all of this is basically to underpin the idea of this cabal of decision makers that are basically running rampant and out of control and unchecked. Now, here in Storytime, we're familiar with this outline of shadowy business because it doesn't always come in the form of one intelligence agency or one military branch. It's usually a big concoctive mix of all of these things. And so to help us focus this concept of the deep state, as it were, I think it's important for us to look at the works of Dr. Peter Dale Scott. He's a Berkeley professor who writes extremely well about these topics, and I highly encourage you to follow his works. It's because of him that I even know anything remotely about these kinds of links, and also just because of him I've come across really great other researchers like Daniel Lists and others in the field that have really gone to great lengths to actually interview people and do the deep research necessary to kind of bring to the public eye the most important features and the most important links to truly give us the deep knowledge, not only the knowledge but the wisdom of what's really befallen us as a society, and why we maybe find ourselves in the situations we kind of do at the moment. So join us if you dare. Strap yourselves in. Make sure you have your beverage with you. This is going to be a very interesting one. And for those of you that haven't ever joined us for story time, let me tell you a little bit about it. So basically, in summary, I'm just some dude on the internet. I'm not an expert. I mean, I've got a background in politics and international relations and philosophy, and so that's where all my interest comes from. But I'm here just learning this as much as you are, and we're kind of in this dialectic together. So feel free, as always, to ask comments, questions, however your heart desires. In a sense, the floor is also yours. And I'm just going to be, again, presenting you always a grain of truth wherever I can, if not more, and just bring you some of the interesting facts about our history and our politics and kind of like this mysterious smudge that you get when you kind of squeeze the two together. It's like the CERN Hadron Collider. It's like when you smash these things together, you find interesting bits and pieces come flying off. And that's really what we need to pay attention to. If anything, even if you're not an American person, in America, America is a sort of superpower and leader of countries around the world, and kind of a dictator in a sense of the policy that we follow at a supranational level. Or international level, I suppose. You find that we kind of look to them and are affected by them as a nation state. And so, whilst we love the people, it's important to have a look at the structures that also kind of control and guide us. And I just wanted to say, for those of you that have never joined us for story time, as I said, we kind of try and bring to you some interesting facts. That's all we do. Just have fun with it. Research it, as always. Be skeptical. I make tons of mistakes. I'm notorious for mixing dates and names. But I try. So, everyone, I do welcome you to Storytime 10, and let's jump straight into it, shall we? Now, the first thing that I want to do here is we are talking about the quote-unquote deep state a little bit. Now, I want to use the works of Dr. Peter Dale Scott, specifically because he's an academic and because his sober thinking about this gaseous outline of people that are unelected and unaccountable, and there's many other terms that go with this concept of the deep state. And I really want to talk to you about it first and foremost before we jump in, because one of the things that Dr. Scott mentions, and quite often in his writings, is that the deep state, as it were, should first and foremost not really have a physical definition, because he argues that the concept, and this you find in international relations theory and just general politics in the textbooks, a state is an organized structure. It basically has intersecting social and political and economic forces that all kind of interweave themselves. And in a sense, it should be all by the rule of law, for the people, by the people, generally speaking. And there's different flavors of political organization. But really what Dr. Scott wants us to keep in mind here is that, and we've seen this with story times in the past, he wants us to know that these forces that come from people that have great swaths of power and can affect not only the political but industrial and scientific and therefore the social realms of existence, they're not always the president. They're not always the people you see on TV. In a sense, it's kind of important to note that, or Dr. Scott mentions that it's important to almost realize that part of the definition is that the deep state is not organized. Right? It itself is this shadowy outline that spans across the private and the public sector. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind here, that it's not always, the person you see on TV. It's quite a meshed network, and sometimes a bit of a rotating door. You'll find people that generally work in the defense. In the Department of Defense, and then will find themselves members of the board of Raytheon, and then they'll retire from Raytheon and then go do consulting back for the Pentagon, and back and forward. So it is important to keep your eye on this kind of thing. Now, the other few things that Dr. Scott wants us to remember about this concept of what he actually better defines as the deep political system. And the way he kind of understands this deep political system is, you could imagine it as, he uses the term the overworld. So that's the world that you and I exist in, right? We wake up, we go to work, we go to school, we do what we need to do, make dinner at night, watch a bit of Netflix or whatever the case is, and just chill out as humans. We want to hang out and watch our children grow and, expand our horizons as best as we can, whether that's knowledge or with experience. We're not involved in this different kind of thinking about 50-year strategies and, defense of the nation and the secrecy that goes around, kind of ducking and diving laws to go forward with secret programs. This is now referring to intelligence services and other agencies and, political institutions that basically have these powers of surveillance and, we'll see later, many other tools at their disposal. But basically the aim is political power at the highest level. And that's something that the overworld is affected by, but doesn't really, we kind of living our lives, right? As humans, we just want to take cool pictures for our Instagram, and maybe we have other more lofty endeavors, but basically we just want to chill. Now, Dr. Dale Scott then says there's the Underworld. That's a very apt name for it, I think. The Underworld is this bizarre, as I said, mishmash of people. And they are basically, and it can be different kinds of people. I mean, it can be people from Wall Street, so it can be bankers and investors, it can be lawyers, it can be politicians, it can be military people, intelligence people, it can be, anyone can be a part of this deep political system, just depending on how they fit into the whole thing. But basically this underworld, it lives by a different set of rules. And we see that through any kind of scandal that we've seen with any kind of the intelligence agencies or governments. Time and time again, we see that there are rules for them and not for the rest of us. And Dr. Dale Scott says that when these two worlds basically interact, that is where you get the deep state. And where they interact, he says that there is violent forces that come, because obviously normal people think normally, and we're not planning coups, and we're not planning secret programs to, suppress people and, rendition and all the kind of illegal things that, these people will do, and under the guise of plausible deniability and national security and all these other terms, they'll basically say it's not illegal if we're not caught. And that's not the way to really think as a soul-searching, expanding human, in my opinion. So, Dr. Dale Scott says that when the overworld and the underworld basically interact and there's this violent storm between them, he has mentioned that it's a good way to think of it as almost like a weather system, because because it's not a defined structure, this deep state thing, there's also forces within it that some are good, some are bad, some have ulterior motives. So there are currents that push and pull against each other, even within the deep state. But to help us kind of think about it, he does say that there is a generalization that can be made between this tension, as it were, this tension between an internationalist view of power and a more centralized view of national power. So basically, that internationalist aspect is the one that really interests us, because in a sense, when we see a lot of the directions that the United Nations is going, the monetary policies are going, the European Union and many other countries, just look at the response we had with COVID, right? It was a unified multinational event, and we followed each other as countries, you know, with our, we said, what does the CDC say? What does the UN say? What does the World Health Organization say? We defer to these other non-locally national forces for information, and everybody kind of follows suit. And this kind of internationalism, where at a global level there is supranational forces kind of making countries act in whatever way. Either you can look at the economics of the Dutch farmers recently, or the austerity measures placed on people in France, and that's just sort of Europe looking at that. But basically, you can see that people are pulling in one direction, and there is another bigger force that gets governments to move in another. And so we lose a little bit of our sovereignty as national countries, eroded by, obligations that we've signed to. Fair enough, we are signatories to the United Nations Charter and things like that, as South Africa, let's say. But at the same time, let's take a look at BRICS in South Africa's context. We have obligations now to much higher levels of just the national interest. In fact, the national interest has become embedded in international affairs. And so the local people don't get that exact, first gear drive out of these economic projects, because they are tailored from the top end down. But I digress. The whole point of this is that Dr. Scott says that we have this violent force when these overworld and underworld kind of entities begin to rub against each other. Now, if you're part of the overworld and you're living a normal life, as I said, you're not thinking in terms of doomsday cult, mutually assured destruction and other ways to subvert your enemy. And that's the underworld's job. And so when we encounter these things, we're just like, what is going on here? What the hell is this? What is Operation Northwards? What is the Bay of Pigs invasion? What is, coup d'etats and color revolutions and all this illegal business, Who's who's controlling all of this? These are very valid questions that the overworld will ask of the underworld, and the underworld will then lie and cover it all up. And we'll see this very, you can't miss it. You'll see it very clearly with the examples of Watergate, Iran-Contra, Pentagon files, the Durham Report. This is how we're going to start to bring together all these subjects and really get a good magnification into it. We're going to make it a very clear picture if we can. So, just finishing off with the deep states. As I said, there's this conflict between the international and the nationalist and the internationalist forces within this deep political system. Now, as I said, these political actors and their processes, they are not governed by basic common law or social norms. They are not really recognized by the laws in the way that they need to be for checks and balances to keep them from abusing power. And so that's why the definition is good to keep it a little bit gaseous. And these institutions, as I mentioned, because of plausible deniability, and they play the national security card, there is very little accountability because the secrecy of a lot of these things. The highest level of secrecy, of course, is what we looked at in StoryTime 9 regarding continuation of governments. And that was so secret and so powerful that it might override constitutional laws. In fact, it's kind of like a martial law on evil steroids, in a certain sense. So that's more or less what we looked at in Storytime 9, and then we see how this could easily become a breakaway civilization. If you got a bunch of rich people that are very militarily capable, and they've got massive underground cities and all the access to the things they need, they basically don't need anything on the surface, including the people there. So we looked at some of the boring conflagrators, in other words, the boring machines that they use for these tunnels. It was very interesting, but this is all continuation of government. This is the secret presidential decrees that come into effect when the emergencies are declared. This is at least in the United States. And we see from these deep events that Dr. Dale Scott talks about, he includes, for example, 9/11, that these powers continue to become further and further expanded. And the terminology begins to change, and the brazenness of which freedoms are eroded is also quite unprecedented, at least in my lifetime. And so he goes to point out that there's these commonalities between these deep events like 9/11 and the expansion of the Homeland Security concept. What is the homeland? It has no legal standing in the American Constitution. It's sort of all made up and linked to the Strategic Defense Initiative, and if it doesn't, get signed every year, basically doesn't exist because it's not in the basis of the overall Constitution and laws. That's at least in my opinion. So really, this is what we're saying when we talk about deep state, because when Trump talks about deep state, who knows what he's talking about? When Washington Post talks about deep state, who knows what they're talking about? But Peter Dale Scott gives us a very good definition. He points out that this can be a range of actors, but all of them are unaccountable, whether they're private or public, and a lot of them are, contractors like Booz Allen Hamilton and the SAIC. NSA, CIA, these things soak up about 70% of the defense budget of the United States, last I checked. And that is a massive amount of money going to these wild agencies that just go and do whatever they want. And we'll look at that quite specifically. Maybe not in their most extreme form, in the sense that, if we really wanted to look at violent rebellions and coup d'etats and stuff, we could, see the chaos that was caused in different parts of the world by the CIA. But we'll brush against that very, very shortly, but just focus around some of the big political scandals that even today have some of its information classified, and how it links back to the Durham Report, which is what we're going to sort of start off with. The last thing I just want to mention about the deep state before we start off with the Durham Report is that basically what the deep state is involved with, and I want to make this clear because I think this is an amazing point that Dr. Peter Dale Scott makes. He basically says the continuation of government and its doomsday network is basically what is going to control the population during an unpopular war or emergency. Now, when you can create wars and emergencies, you have basically the mentality and the ability and the resource and the planning to really take away basic rights. And in Storytime 9, for example, we looked at Rex 84, I believe it was. Let me just pull that up and check that I haven't got that one wrong. I believe it was Rex 84. Now, Rex 84, remember, is the is not the plan. It was one of the activities under the umbrella of the readiness exercises that they were doing. Let me bring it up on screen for you guys. Here we go. Because this really is a good way to highlight this continuation of government business, how it's like the highest level of secrecy in one regard, and in the other regard, how it comes with these people that are thinking about the worst case scenario at every moment and how to control the population when they do things that are not legal or popular. So let's have a quick read here. Rex 84, short for Readiness Exercise 1984, classified scenario and drill developed by the United States federal government to detain large numbers of United States citizens deemed to be national security threats. I'm just going to stop there for a second. So, note the air quotes, okay? National security threats. Now, whatever that is defined as, like today, it can be many things. Having a diluted definition means that a lot of people can be tracked, traced, databased, and then eventually from these lists rounded up and physically removed from freedom. And if you think they haven't done it before, you know, Rex 84, for example, was an exercise in planning that. And there's been, you know, if you look at the during Pearl Harbor, how the Japanese Americans were also put in internment camps. You know, but there goes their rights for national security. Now, you may argue that that is right or wrong, necessary or unnecessary, but the fact of the matter is, it needs to be based in the law, and if the supreme law is the Constitution, you shouldn't be discriminating your citizens by race and color and all these things. That should have happened before their vetting and becoming citizens, and unless you've got evidence and things like that, but you can't just round up general populations. So let's just read a little bit further here. In the event that the president declared a national emergency, these national security threats from these national security threats, the president could declare a national emergency. The plan was first revealed and detailed in a major daily newspaper. So again, it's not like an easy policy papers available to the public. You know, you kind of discover this through like a leak to the Miami Herald in 1987. Possible reasons for such a roundup were reported to be widespread opposition to U.S. military invasion abroad, such as if the United States were to directly invade Central America. Now, you must remember that this is 1987. The USA is invading Central America. Color revolutions, Nicaragua. I mean, you name any South American state around this time, and you can see that there is intelligence shenanigans going on. And we'll look at the Iran-Contras a little bit later just to make that point clear. You know, let's not go into all the examples, but you know, even if you just consider the fact that who was the cocaine smuggler? What was his name? It'll come back to me, but he had basically all of this help from the CIA to basically smuggle cocaine. Let's see. I can't believe his name is not coming to me in this moment. It's not Guzman. No, good try though. Pablo Escobar. My goodness, I can't believe his name didn't come to me. Anyways, Pablo Escobar. So obviously Pablo Escobar was also involved with ties to the American intelligence services, and again, examples of just illegal behavior to try and fund certain things, and this is going to become much clearer as we go forward. But here we're looking at the secrecy around, for example, the Rex 84 and other continuation of government, factors. This is where the deep state often resides because it's the highest level of security, and so it's the highest level where these crimes can, or not crimes, but where these challenges to freedom, with the excuse of national security and emergency, kind of clash. There's going to be this big tension between what the military and the government thinks is good for the people and what the people think is good for the people. So, unfortunately, the military is very well armed. So, their highest level of thinking, again, is trying to make sure that they don't get dissent to their policy objectives. And often these policy objectives are wrought with erosions to democracy and open societies and things that, like, Kennedy believed in. That's JFK. He spoke about an open society and, curtailing the powers of the CIA. And he was disgusted to see the Bay of Pigs invasion into Cuba, the anti-Castro coup d'etat, basically, that was happening unbeknownst to him. And, we'll see that through the Iran-Contra, parts of the government that once were just supposed to be bodies of intelligence gathering to advise the president suddenly start taking covert actions themselves to give weapons to this country and, pay off freedom fighters in another country, and that's the Iran-Contra. We'll get to that in just a moment. But I hope this kind of clears up this initial section that we wanted to talk about the deep state falling around this concept of continuation of government. And Rex 84, as I said, it was one of these exercises that eventually we became aware of them. And here was the section, for example, where Senator Inouye said, he was asked, Mr. Chairman, because I read in Miami papers and several others that there had been a plan developed by that same agency, a contingency plan in the event of emergency, that would suspend the American Constitution, I was deeply concerned about it and wondered if that was an area which so-and-so had worked on. I believe it was, and I wanted to get this confirmation. And Senator Inouye basically said, I respectfully request that the matter not be touched upon at this stage. If we want to get into this, I'm certain arrangements can be made by executive session. So it's an important thing to keep in mind. There is something that can overtake this political machine that is supposed to be designed by the citizens and voted on at, a certain level, and we're supposed to be informed. The only way we can really control the machine is if we're informed about how it's functioning and operating and how it's being maintained. If it's doing things that we're unaware of, we're not in control. And also, if we don't know how it works, it may do unexpected things that we're unaware of and don't want. If we don't want a war, the machine might lead us to one. And, that's so important to kind of keep in mind today. So, this is basically, as I said, this is basically Dr. Peter Dale Scott's outline of the deep state or the deep political system, the overworld and the underworld that kind of clash together and create these deep events like Watergate and 9/11 and other ones that you might think of. He lists that they have similarities to them. From the get-go, there is a clear story from the intelligence agencies, but the stories themselves are full of holes. The commissions never seem to amount to much, and there's always political influence, let's just say, at either limiting or restricting some of these commissions, and that these deep events make changes to the fundamental fabric of society, both on a legal point of view, like, for example, if we see 9/11 with the Patriot Act, you'll see this in other ways, like the way we now travel, and we can't have more than this amount of toothpaste and that amount of perfume, and this all came from an event that is now deeply ingrained in our social consciousness. So these are the deep events that Peter Dale Scott talks about. So when we say deep state, we're not meaning some esoteric QAnon rubbish. You know, I say rubbish because I'm still needing to be convinced. Good tries, but yeah, I don't know. I like policy documents. Let me put it that way. But we need to look at real history. We need to look at real political scandals. So this jumps us into our opening here. And what we're going to mention now is the Durham Report. So everyone, welcome to Storytime number 10. Okay. This was quite an interesting introduction, as I said, looking at the deep state and what is this nondescript thing that is difficult to define, and what is this force doing to us as a society? What has it done in history? And I think a good example of a deep event of this overworld and underworld clash is, in our day and age now, for example, the Durham Report. I'm going to show you how in the past we had Watergate and you know, the Iran-Contra and the Pentagon Papers as a direct analog of this Durham Report. But this Durham Report is recent. It's happened just a few weeks ago, a week or so ago. And to put it in summary, okay, because I'm going to first give you the... let me just first put it in its sensationalist framing, and then we'll kind of dive a little bit more soberly into it. But basically, when people think about Watergate, any scandal that came after Watergate gets that suffix gate, you know, Russia Gate being a scandal in and of itself, as the Durham Report will show. But adding gate to the end of these scandals is part of our social unconsciousness now because of things like Watergate. And the Durham Report, as I say, will have these interesting links. Now, as I said, my sensationalist sort of rundown of what the Durham Report is basically, let me just say, in my opinion, from the little I've read, remember it's 300 and plus pages, it's just recently come out, so you'll have to forgive me if I'm not incredibly well versed. Yo, what's up, Mr. Beanie? Thanks for the shout out, homie. Thanks for staying up so late and joining us. We're talking about the Durham Reports and just mass hysterical political conspiracy. It's great. So, we were saying, the sensationalist definition of the Durham Report, according to your friendly Euphoria, is basically at its best, is just basically very gross negligence in every level of the intelligence and just political circuits of the American government relating to investigations to Trump and his entourage, you know, General Flynn and other people. So at best, it's a bunch of coincidental fumbling. Oops, I've accidentally oopsed and oopsed and oopsed, and then, you know, it all now comes together with just this amazing inability for the American system to work and function properly, because now you see Trump is being indicted, and for more than one thing, let me just add. And Rainier Isus, thank you so much for the follow. I really appreciate it. You're very welcome for the great content. Please stick around. So I was just saying that the Durham Report, as I said, at best is just a bunch of fumbling people in the intelligence and the political sphere that basically just kind of bumbled together every terrible thing that they could do to basically not have anything favor Trump. And at best, they did it on purpose. And those levels go to the highest levels of just the American leadership. It could go very, very high. So the report is basically just The report is basically just a conclusion about what they've found and what they recommend, and we're going to look at that. And Rainier, you ask thoughts on Russia. Whoa, sure, that's a very big one, and it's not really content of our discussion, but I do want to just say that two things. Firstly, I mean all nations. This is my political opinion because, as I say, a little bit of international relations kind of puts me a little bit on the milquetoast fence. I see all superpowers as inevitable in some way. You know, you're going to have concentrations of power. So whether it's Russia, whether it's China, whether it's America, the important thing is that these countries are part of the nation of states. In other words, there needs to be a balanced level. If you have one country that's the superpower that tries to keep the others down so that it can remain the superpower, over time, that kind of abuse is going to create countries that are aggressive and things like that. So what you really want is, you know, whether it's Russia, China, America, or any future superpower, you want to remember that, firstly, and as you'll see in StoryTime, superpowers are going to do things that superpowers do. And that means many times that it will be illegal, unnecessary, just completely, just terrible decision making, and amounting to loss of life and just all kinds of. I mean, you can just you can read any page in history and see that states don't always get it right. So every superpower needs to be held with great, great care. It is a violent animal that you need to curtail. That's why we talk about freedoms here on this channel, and why it's important to keep in check the powers that kind of control these forces. And Russia has, whether we're talking about America or Russia, both have military contingency plans for continuation of government. Both have within them deep state forces that push and pull for vying of power. And many of these things are done in the underworld, under the radar of the law, under the radar of knowledge of normal people. And so that's why, as I said, we're looking at this Durham Report as something really, really, really super important. Because it's an example, again, in a modern sense, of how these, in this case, intelligence agencies and politicians are just playing games with us and, you know, lying to Congress and all these things. We'll have a look at it in a bit more, in a bit more precision just now. But you say you're a Russian yourself, and you think, what is happiness with this war? It's not controlled by Putin. Might be his clone. That is an interesting point of view. You know, when we invent technologies like CRISPR, when we invent technologies like artificial wombs for growing lab meat and limbs in the lab, and also when our visual effects have gotten to such a stage where, you know, there's plenty of videos of CIA heads talking to game show hosts or to the president, and then suddenly pulling off a mask, and then the president or the game show host is like, oh my goodness, I've been talking to you the whole time, and you look like a real person. Even when you touch them, they seem pretty real. So this concept of clones and the fact that we live in a post-truth world, I guess, does make the concept of leaders being doubles, being clones, being just not what we are told. Very, very, yeah, it's a juicy subject to get into. I mean, we're going to be talking about Ronald Reagan later, and we know that he was an actor that became president, a little bit like the Ukrainian current president. And let's see, one more question. Sure, go ahead. Thoughts on Andrew Tate? Look, I think there are different approaches to growing as a human spirit, and I think there are great lessons to be taken from Andrew Tate. And I mean, basically, he's a stoic, in my opinion. If you go look at the Spartans, they basically Andrew Tate on steroids. Now, that means that I don't agree with all of it, but there is the desire to become better. And that is, I think, one way of doing it. And I think a lot of, as you can see with the media, there's been a lot of push against narratives. And again, we'll see this now. We're going to jump into the Watergate scandal, Iran-Contra. We're going to be looking at this a little bit, and you'll see that there again, media, politicians, intelligence agencies, they'll feed you information and plot people against each other and make sure that citizens are in a state of tension so that they're more easy to control, you know. Let's not even get into the MK Ultra stuff, you know, mind control and all of that. So I hope that answered your questions, but let's just jump straight back into StoryTime 10. And everyone, welcome. It's really a pleasure to have you guys. We're going to now look at Watergate quickly. Oh, wait, Durham Report. Let me just finish that very, very quickly. I want to give you guys just as I said, it's 300 and something pages. So what we know, in fact, let me actually pull it up on screen for you guys. I mean, you know, I love policy documents. So, you know, I'm a sucker for policy documents. So here we go. Have a look at this Durham Report, shall we? So this is the Durham Report recently, as you can see, signed May 12th, 2023. Merrick Garland was the attorney, and I actually think it's worth reading the executive summary. And I mean, if you just even go through the if you even just go through the index, it just sounds so bad. It's like activity authorized before opening and assessment, unpopularity, perjury. Crossfire Hurricane was the name of the investigation. We'll be talking about that in a bit, but you can see disparate treatment of candidates, threat of foreign election influence. All of this was something else. But I'll read you the executive summary so you can get in the words. And Rainier, you're totally welcome. I want to give you this. I read this in the words of the text itself, so that you really get a good sense of what they're referring to here. So let's get the executive summary. Where's it at? Introduction. Executive summary. Oh yeah. So forgive me, I'm going to put on my reading voice for a little while. But again, what I'm trying to show you here is that basically the FBI committed criminal offenses. Just no two ways about it. Kevin Kleinsmith is definitely on the chopping block. He fabricated information to the FISA court for a surveillance order. Other FBI personnel were involved in casual approach to accuracy and completeness. No probable cause, disregarded exculpatory information, lack of analytical rigor. So, yeah, especially regarding information towards politically affiliated individuals and entities. Does this not begin to sound like Watergate? And if you don't know what Watergate is, we're going to get into it. So, you know, basically, if you put this all together, it's the report here. I'll just read this little summary. The report emphasizes the need for the FBI and the department to recognize and rectify these deficiencies to ensure the proper conduct of their sensitive functions. It does not recommend major changes to existing guidelines and policies, but stresses the importance of integrity and fidelity to the current rules and principles. So basically, they're saying, okay, we shouldn't disband the FBI, but these are very serious problems. And as I said, it has to do with political campaigns accusing presidents of essentially being treasonous culprits with foreign countries. Like, this goes super, super deep, you know? Some of the people that, or the agencies that are incriminated in this is like the FBI, the Department of Justice, the Comey, McCabe, let's see here, Lisa Page, FISA judges, Rosenstein, Chris Wray, Gina Haspel. Oh my goodness, Gina Haspel's going to have a lot of explaining to do. Sally Yates, Lisa Monaco. I mean, the list just goes on and on. And of course, it can go as high as the Clinton family themselves, maybe straight to Hillary. Who knows? But the point of this is that it shows that all of this push was against Donald Trump for a political stymieing, let me put it that way. They were basically trying to put a roadblock on his presidential powers or his ascension to the presidency. And even now, you can kind of see that same kind of pressure is being put on him. Now, obviously, if a person has done an illegal thing, they are innocent until proven guilty, and they should be tried before a court. So, you know, if you want to impeach away. But we can't have the FBI and other intelligence agencies providing these courts with lies and misdirection at the behest of a political opponent. So let me read you the executive summary here very quick. I'm sure you've maybe had a good gloss over it. So, the executive summary should give you this brief outline. It basically says the public record contains a substantial body of information relating to former President Trump and the Trump's organization's relationship with Russian businesses, Russian business people and Russian officials, as well as the separate evidence of Russia's attempt to interfere in the 2016 presidential election. So those were all the accusations, let's say, that were investigated and laid against Trump. And it goes further and it says, these and related subjects are well documented in careful examinations undertaken. And in his report entitled Investigations into Russian Interference in the 2016 Presidential Election in 2019, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence also had one called Russian Active Measures Campaigns and Interference in the 26 U.S. election. The scope of these earlier inquiries, the amount of important information gathered, and the contributions that they have made to our understanding of the Russian election interference efforts are a tribute to the diligent work and the dedication of those charged with the responsibility of conducting them. Our review and investigation, in turn, has focused on the separate but related questions, including the following. So they basically say, look, you know, we were doing security like we do. You know, foreign countries are going to try and always affect the politics of anyone that they find a good target for that sort of thing. And instead, what we're getting is, you know, they although this is the FBI saying, look, we made some mistakes, don't disband us, we did a good job, here is what kind of came from this. Number one, they ask, was there adequate predication for the FBI to open the Crossfire Hurricane investigation from its inception in 2016 as a full counterintelligence and foreign agents registration investigation? Given the requirements of the Attorney General's guidelines for the FBI domestic operations and FBI policies relating to the use of at least intrusive investigative tools, was that necessary? So what they were saying there is, you know, was it following the guidelines of the FBI to use these intrusive tools to do this investigation? And the investigation was called, the operation was called Crossfire Hurricane. And was the opening of Crossfire Hurricane as a full investigation consistent with how the FBI handled other intelligence, you know, prior or concerning the attempts by foreign interests to influence the Clinton and other campaigns? So in other words, they're basically saying, are we doing fair treatment? Is the FBI treating the Clinton campaign the same way that they treated the Trump campaign? And the answer is, not so much. Did the FBI properly consider highly significant intelligence it received? So let me just let me summarize this a little bit further. So he says there, at the same time, was that information used to predict? Sorry, my apologies. So regarding the Trump campaign versus the Clinton campaign, was this used to vilify Donald Trump by stirring up a scandal claiming interference by Russian security services, which may have shed light on some of the Russia information the FBI was receiving from third parties, including the Steele dossier, Alpha Bank allegations, and the confidential human resources reporting? Question mark. If not, were any provable federal crimes committed in failing to do so? Was there evidence of the actions of any FBI personnel or third parties related to the operation investigation that may have violated any federal criminal statutes, including the prohibition against making false statements to federal officials? Was there evidence of the actions of the FBI and department personnel in providing false or incompetent information to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, the FISC? And did this violate criminal statutes? So basically they go into this, and the amount of information that comes in, as I said, this is, how many pages did we say? 316. As I scroll down this, you can have a read for it yourself. It's a publicly available document. So I encourage you to go and have a good look at what the FBI at the tip of the iceberg has kind of put forward, and the further investigations that are going to be coming out of this. And I want to make this point clear, because when we have a look at the Watergate scandal with Nixon, you'll see that it wasn't just one incident and then suddenly, hey presto, he was, found guilty and then had to step down. There were phases. There were distinct phases where a little bit of the truth came out at a time, a little bit. And it's only as the truth circle got bigger and more lies began to kind of come up that we really, then start to see the clear picture. So what you're seeing here from the FBI, as I said, is just a small tip of the iceberg, but at least it is quite a relatively good report for all intents and purposes. I think it has opened the doors and it has opened the doors for criticism and has looked at itself self-critically. As I say, perhaps disbanding the FBI. I'm a bit of a person that believes that people should look after their own immediate kind of Dunbar number level society, and then have cooperatives in that regard. So I'm always closer to the anarchist argument of just self-sustainability and as little government as possible. The government, in my opinion, should just be informing us and providing us with basic services, not sending armies abroad or things like that. That's something that people should decide. So anyways, as I was saying, the Watergate scandal came to us bit by bit, and this Durham Report is a little piece that has now chipped away and begun exposing the cracks. And as I mentioned, it really does show quite a few important things. It basically shows that the FBI did not have a legitimate basis to do some of its investigating. It was going after people for political objectives. It was receiving direction from political adversaries. It manipulated info to the courts. It basically lied to the courts. They were using raw and unanalyzed, uncorroborated intelligence. Like, for example, the Steele dossier. That made all kinds of accusations that Trump did this and Trump did that. And then at the end of the day, it was a ex-MI something agent. It doesn't really have a lot of credibility in this regard, and that's what they base themselves on, and it's basically this different standard between allegations from the Trump side of the campaign and the Clinton side of the campaign, and this report makes that quite obvious, and I'm sure there will be many that will follow. So the one thing I want to end with regarding the Durham Report is that the report not only says, let's not disband. We don't think that any major modifications need to be made to the FBI, but it does also conclude that there is no evidence of a deep state conspiracy to frame Trump. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I have to have a little bit of a laugh at that. I do. I must. Well, I can't help myself. Excuse me. Now, I'm not a big Trump fan. I'm not. I try to be objective where I can. I have opinions, and I base them on ideas that are hopefully, corroborated by good evidence and sound thinking. But I try, at least. But what I want to say here is, we just saw earlier the definition from Dr. Peter Dale Scott, about some of the definitions regarding the deep state, okay? And how it's a vacuous and gaseous, undefinable kind of group of decision makers that are basically running around lawless, have no accountability, and at the same time create these deep events. Now think about that for a second. American foreign policy hasn't really made much of a big difference or change until Trump came along. And then you had things like the Abraham Accords. Then suddenly you had things like crossing over the Korean DMZ to meet with Kim Jong-un. Beginning in earnest to engage with the American public about, like, why are we in Syria? What are we doing here? Why are we fighting this and that war? So it's interesting that you see this Durham Report indicating all this political favoritism against Trump, because Trump is trying to move the needle in a different direction, whether you like him or not. You can see now in FBI disclosure the lengths and the levels that these people have gone to put Trump at a major political disadvantage, and to try to keep the circles of power to themselves. Okay, now keep that in mind. Keep that in mind, because now we're going to move to Watergate. And, I wasn't around when all of this happened, so it's not information that's deeply ingrained in my mind. So I might make a few mistakes here, but there are a few key people that come up in Watergate. And one interesting thing is, here in Storytime, we often talk about the UFO file, the advanced technology, the X-Files, the aerospace technologies, special access programs, all of that, like, mysteriously off-world things. And I just want to say that we're going to go forward trying to just keep on the politics side, but I want to let you know that at every turn, if you open the door next to you, you'll bump into that UFO file. So when we're talking about Ronald Reagan, and we're talking about the Iran-Contra, and we're talking about the Secretary of Defense, and all this very boring politics stuff, just remember that we're also talking about Strategic Defense Initiative, or the Star Wars program, or Ronald Reagan was an interesting president, also an actor that became president, but a president that was involved during a very important time in the American space program and missile defense initiatives. And he was the famous president. I wonder if I've got it here somewhere. Let's see if we can call it up. He was the president at the United Nations that basically said, wouldn't it be such a... Actually, I have to get the quote exact. Because it's too good. Oh, here we go. Seems YouTube does have this. So let me put this up on screen for you guys. Let's make sure there's volume as well. So this is Ronald Reagan And he is at the United Nations giving a speech about democracy and freedom and all these things. And then he goes off on a tangent at this one point. And he starts to say, basically, I'm paraphrasing here, but wouldn't it be interesting how quickly we would put aside our differences and make peace if we all faced a threat that was maybe from beyond this world? Okay, let's listen to it in Reagan's own words. Oh, sorry, that's not coming through to you one more time. So I'm just going to play this short clip here. Let's try that. There we go.
Perhaps we need some outside universal threat. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet, I ask you, is not an alien force already among us?
Is an alien force not already among us? Okay. Now, many say at the time he was probably talking about Iran or some other foreign adversary, in the Soviet Union or something. Korea maybe, but there it is. He kind of puts it in a very interesting kind of black and white term. So that's what I wanted to mention there, that we're not going to talk so much about the UFO file and special access programs and advanced technology, but just keep in mind that at any moment you turn a knob on any door and you open it, and there it is. For example, tonight we're going to speak about Watergate, and we're going to speak about, we've spoken in the past about John F. Kennedy and his assassination. Now, what's interesting is that you'll see, again, this crisscross of the UFO file, where Douglas Caddy is briefly the prosecutor for the Watergate burglars. And later on, he mentions that he was told that Kennedy was basically assassinated specifically because he wanted to share this UFO technology with the Russians, with the Soviets at the time. So, as you can see, there's deep waters there to sort of go through. Douglas Caddy, actually, here we go. There's this little excerpt from Wikipedia that we can have a look at. So let's just have a quick look. I want you to see his face, because he's still around and such, and he's given written books, and he's given talks and such like that. So yeah, this is a more modern photo of Douglas Caddy. And as I said, he was involved in the Watergate scandal, basically. As this Durham Report is a major level scandal, so was Watergate. And in fact, his persona was played by, I'm not too sure if it was, let's see here, this movie here, The President's Men, which was an American biographical political drama thriller, and it had Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman, and one of them actually played Douglas Caddy. So my apologies, Douglas Caddy. So Douglas Caddy, as you can see here at the bottom of his Wikipedia, he claims that when he asked Howard Hunt why President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, Hunt told him it was because Kennedy was about to disclose the alien presence to the Soviet Union. And we know this because in previous story times we looked at the memorandum where Kennedy wrote to the CIA saying, give me all the high threat cases, because we don't want the Russians to mistake this as some form of disguised first strike attack. Kennedy was very concerned about the state of mutually assured destruction and the nuclear tensions between America and the Soviet Union. So it's interesting that, as I say, we have this UFO file just at the edge of everything we'll be touching on this evening. But as mentioned, we're going to just try to stick to the basics of the policy stuff that we have before us. But if you don't know who Howard Hunt is, we're going to come across him very quickly, because he becomes front and center in the Watergate scandal. So let's start looking at Watergate, shall we? Now, why are we looking at Watergate? Firstly, let's frame this. And before I frame this, let me just say to everyone, thank you for staying with us during this broadcast. We're about an hour and a half in. We're going to be spending another hour or so. Please feel free to drop comments or questions. Welcome to Storytime 10. We are looking at the deep state, the real academic definition that Peter Dale Scott gives us. And we've now looked at the Durham Report as an example of these deep events that change society and affect us even when we're outside of the United States. And it is an example of how our freedoms can become eroded or subverted by these military and intelligence services. Not always military and intelligence. As Peter Dale Scott says, you can't really define the deep state. It's an activity of people. That's why he actually says calling it the deep state is not accurate. A state is organized. This cabal is a diffuse, non-really descript group of sociopaths, in my opinion. But let's move forward. So the reason we are welcoming you to Storytime 10 is now we're passing into Watergate. The Durham Report is a great example in modern times of what it must have been like back in the, I think it was the 70s, 1973 circa, that all of this kind of Watergate business begins to unfold. And that is a big political scandal that basically erupts in American politics and causes a constitutional crisis. Now, in politics, a constitutional crisis basically means there is no more trust in the government and the rule of law and the current administration, the current institutions that tell you pay your taxes or else, you know. And it was really a deep event, as Dr. Peter Dale Scott says. And again, in it, you'll see the fingerprints of the intelligence services, very clear. A very clear narrative that then obviously is full of holes and then is challenged, and then the commissions don't get where they need to go, and you know, it sounds familiar, doesn't it? So let's start to jump in here. Now, Watergate, as I say, is an event that we have to kind of cast our mind back to not 1973, sorry, 1972. That's when it all began. Okay. Now, what happened here? Watergate is actually it's a very beautiful building. It is the Democratic National Committee's headquarters. Basically, in America, there's two parties, the Republican, well, not only two parties, but there's two major parties, right? And the Democratic Party have their headquarters at this DNC HQ called Watergate. That's where the Watergate or gate suffix part comes in. Let's have a look at the complex, shall we, whilst we're chatting about this. Here's just a couple of images I'm going to put up for you. And I'll tell you a little bit about the story. Now, as I said, I'm not an expert and I'm going back on memory from the past, but what basically happens here is that this is the center for the political opposition against Nixon at the time. Nixon is a Republican. He's paranoid. We now know that he had the intelligence services and other parts of, say, the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, and other people in his committee and other parts and structures of the state, and not, because apparently there's also organized crime and all kinds of, you know, wonderful people. Let's just satirically say it that way, or sarcastically, sorry, say it that way. But basically, Nixon keeps this nest of hornets around him, and he uses this as political power to subvert just illegal activities or anyone that is getting close to uh, taking away his throne as the American president. Now, in these attempts that Nixon, and now it took us a very long time to eventually tie Nixon to this. Everyone underneath him was blamed, but now we can say it was right up to the president. In fact, he resigned at the end. But let me show you the lengths that he went to basically try and subvert the political opposition. At the time, the Democratic Committee. Now it's kind of the roles are reversed, right? The Durham Report, we see that's the Democratic National Committee, or say the Democratic side, that have put this political witch hunt on Trump, who's the Democratic runner. So it's interesting how the pendulum kind of swings that way, right? So you're seeing pictures here of this beautiful building, the DNC Watergate complex. And basically what happens is in June in 1972, Officer Mills is, he was, he had previous work. He was just a normal officer. He had kind of taken a smaller role as a patrol officer because working in industrial cities, he noticed was bad and all these things. And investigation as an investigator was dangerous work and stuff. So he, just decided to become an officer, was patrolling around the block, and basically he finds a padlock, and on the padlock there is a piece of tape, and he's like, well, I don't see any obvious anything. So he pulls the piece of tape off and he starts to do his rounds again. And whilst he's doing his rounds, he comes back and he says, let me just go check that out again one more time. And he gets back there and he notes that another piece of tape has been put on. So he says, this is suspicious. He calls it in. And before you know it, the police show up and they find 5 people hiding in the DNC headquarters. And these 5 men were eventually charged with attempted burglary. But they were there trying to plant bugs and steal documents and who knows what else as well. And not only did this eventually first, these 5 get caught, and then did the money that was kind of funding them get traced back to basically Nixon's presidential re-election committee. But then the names start to come out. Okay. So basically 5 people are arrested. It's James McCord. Now, he is, it's crazy land out here. This is basically the 1970s. JFK has been put aside. American foreign policy is, the secret foreign policy, let's say, is going rampant. And I say the secret foreign policy because when you look at like Ellsberg's leaks of the Pentagon Papers showing that the Vietnam War had been expanded and the people had been lied to, and the Congress was not aware of some of the other military incursions that were going on. That's why I say military expansionism at this point for the US is going unabated. And when we look at the Iran-Contras, we see that, they're using money from weapons from Iran to then give us the anti-Sandinista militants, and it's a really big mess. If President Kennedy could have put some brakes, maybe we wouldn't be seeing all this rampant illegality. But instead, we know what happened to him and what followed with his brother as well. So, scores of assassinations in the 60s, political upheaval, and now consolidation. Now the US is basically pumping. It's fighting wars it wants to win. It's, friends with Saddam against Iran, and it's the time of the Persian Gulf. So this is the kind of time we find ourselves in. And I'm kind of framing this because when we find these 5 burglars, the first one that came into view was James McCord. Um, James McCord was basically FBI and CIA, you know, and he was dismissed later. But I mean, um, this guy's got ties that go very deep into secret coups in South America and things like that. And the same will be said, obviously, for some of the other burglars like Liddy. So McCord is found. Gonzalez, I can't remember his first name. Frank Sturgis is the other one. Let me try to think. So it's, as I said, James McCord, Gonzalez, Sturgis, Martinez, and Bernard Baker. Now, Gonzalez was a locksmith and a refugee from Cuba after Castro's come to power, after his rise to power. So, he's he gets pulled in from the Bay of Pigs and the CIA. Sturgis is a CIA, also anti-Castro activities. He's the one that basically recruits the anti-Cuban group of Martinez and Barker. Barker was also intelligence, involved also in the Bay of Pigs. So again, CIA, coup d'etats, overthrowing governments, that kind of business. So these are the kinds of people that the DNC has sent in to go and do this political shenanigery to try and get Nixon re-elected, or at least to subvert his political opponents. He's sending CIA operatives and people that are very heavy duty. Like when you go and coup another country, you're willing to attack. I mean, when you create false flags and things like that and plant evidence and stage things, and you're lying, you're cheating, you're stealing, you're probably hurting innocent people, is kind of what we get from the records of CIA activity. So, already the group of burglars is a bit of a strange one, and they get sent into the DNC headquarters and they get caught by the police and they are arrested. The 5 men are charged for also, intercepting and telephone calls and tampering with communications and breaking cabinets and things like that. And basically they get they get indicted by a grand jury. Now, from that, more names begin to pop out, and the 2 big ones that pop out is Gordon Liddy, and when you see a picture of him, actually, let's call him up, shall we? Gordon Liddy was basically the mastermind that came up with the so he was a former FBI agent. Let me start there. He also was involved with the Treasury, so he knew how to move the money around. And, he refused to answer many questions to the commissions and stuff. And basically, they sort of finger him as one of the people that sort of conceived the burglary. He was a former veteran and secret operative, so they thought he was the man for the job. So Gordon Liddy, this is him here. He's written a few books. He's still around, chatting to him. Many people have chatted to him. And he's got, as I said, quite a controversial background in all of this. Okay. In fact, let's actually call him up on Wikipedia here. I always like to get Wiki's opinion on the matter, because sometimes they very milquetoast about things. So, George Gordon Battle Liddy. I don't know, one of his middle names was Battle. That's a new one to me. Lawyer, FBI agent, and also talk show host, actor, convicted felon in the Watergate scandal. The chief operative of the White House plumbers. Now, we'll get to the plumbers in just a moment. He was working alongside Howard Hunt, and I'm going to tell you about him in a moment. But Liddy was convicted of burglary, conspiracy, and refusing to testify to the Senate committee investigating Watergate. He served nearly 52 months in federal prison. So that was the next person to be indicted. And now next to him was obviously Howard Hunt. Okay. Now, this is an intelligence officer from the CIA side. And again, anti-Castro, involved in Bay of Pigs, coup d'etats, all over South America. As I said, at this point in time, America is shaping the world the way it wants to see it. I'm talking about the 70s and the 80s now. And Hunt is interesting because he goes a little bit further back than Liddy does. He's actually involved during World War II with the OSS. So already, before there was the CIA, Howard Hunt was already a secret operative for the OSS. And he had appearances in Life magazine, but, head of the CIA, Helms, loved this guy, even made him head of one of the big corporations. And he was a big fan of Alan Dulles, so that goes to show you kind of the not so great character that this man kind of associated himself with. He loved the Dulles brothers. In fact, he ghost wrote one of the books for Alan Dulles. I think it was a book called The Craft of Intelligence. And The Craft of Intelligence is still official reading. If you go sign up for the CIA and you go to the library, it's in their library. So it's still a valuable manual to this day regarding intelligence and counterintelligence affairs, and how to coup a country and put your own president there illegally without getting caught or caught. That happens quite often. So we know that Nixon meets with Hunt very often, and they're busy doing ops. Just basically all over South America, specifically in Hunt's case in Guatemala. And if you see I think there's also a documentary called Murder Incorporated that really talks about the CIA's involvement in those coups in South America. And, as I said, he loved the Dulles brothers and wrote books about regime change. So, this is the kind of guy that we're dealing with here. Shady. So he gets indicted as well in these courts, and then that's I sort of call that phase 2, and then in phase 3 eventually more names start coming out from Watergate, and it's great. 60 Minutes is up in there. Journalism still kind of functions, and they just get caught lie after lie after lie, and it gets so bad that eventually good old Nixon has to step down before he's actually physically indicted. The only second president ever in the history to have to resign in that matter, to avoid avoid the shame of being indicted. So let's go back to this Watergate scandal. Let's bring this up here. This is from Wikipedia, and one thing I want to point out here is that even though Nixon was found guilty for the highest levels of just political corruption, because even out of this next wave of disclosures, we find out that he was sticking voice activated recording tapes all over the White House and the Oval Office to record different people and get them into just political blackmail situations, and anything he could do to have power swing his way. He kind of did that. It was terrible. But from these tapes, we got a lot of the testimony that eventually sealed his fate. It was the smoking gun, as they called it. Now, as I said, implicated in all of this is the FBI, the CIA, the IRS, his committees, politicians, military people, intelligence. It just goes and goes and goes. Oh, and remember, we were talking about one of the 5 burglars being James McCord. Well, look what they've mentioned here in Wikipedia. They mention here, so this is McCord's wife, Martha Mitchell. Martha Mitchell was the wife of Nixon's Attorney General, John N. Mitchell. I think I've got this a little bit mixed up. But, the Attorney General, John N. Mitchell, who was the 67th Attorney General of the United States under President Richard Nixon and chairman of Nixon's 1968 to 72 presidential campaigns. So he resigned his role so that he could become campaign manager for Nixon, for the CRP, the Committee for the Re-Election of the President, which some people laugh and call it CREEP, because it's CREP, and they just put an extra E in there. But in June 1972, during a phone call with the United Press International, reporter Helen Thomas, with United Press International reporter Helen Thomas, Martha Mitchell, that is the wife of John Mitchell, informed that she was leaving her husband until he resigned from the CRP. The phone call ended abruptly. A few days later, Marcia Kramer, a veteran crime reporter of the New York Daily, tracked Mitchell to the Winchester Country Club in Rye, New York, and described Mitchell as a beaten woman with visible bruises. Mitchell reported that during the week that followed the Watergate burglary, she had been held captive in a California hotel, and that the security guard Steve King ended a call to Thomas by pulling the phone cord from the wall. Mitchell made several attempts to escape via the balcony, but was physically accosted, injured, and forcefully sedated by a psychiatrist. Following conviction for his role in the Watergate burglary, McCord admitted that Mitchell had been basically kidnapped and corroborated the reports of her event. So, James McCord, CIA agent, former FBI, involved in all kinds of shady things, basically says that this thing got so far that we basically went and kidnapped the wife of a person involved in this thing to try and just shut him up, make sure that he played ball. So you can see that the nefarious actions here it's the Wild West, and none of this was available to the public at the time. This is all coming out in drips and drabs. So as you can see from the Wikipedia, the scandal escalates. They have hearings, they find the Watergate tapes, legal action, so on and so forth. And finally, Richard Nixon resigns. You can listen to his 15-minute resignation speech. It's very funny once you look at the sum total of the evidence against him. He was sort of saying, at least my heart was in the right place. And once you look at all of that, you kind of wonder if that really was the case. Now, one thing I just want to mention here as well is that Kissinger, Henry Kissinger, that is at this time head of the National Security Advisory to the President. So he's dealing with the NSA, basically, as an advisor to the President. And when he hears about this scandal, he immediately resigns. And he was never prosecuted or investigated. And it's funny, though, it goes all the way up to the President. But good old Henry Kissinger, he managed to dodge that bullet. And this is actually his resignation letter. And you can see there's no fluff on it. Dear Mr. Secretary, I hereby resign from the office of the President of the United States. Sincerely, Honorable Henry A. Kissinger. Done. Just like that. So there was a cover up of the cover up, and the corruption just goes so many levels deep. And again, if you remember previous story times, the Bay of Pigs, the CIA involvement in Cuba, the anti-Castro things, this is all stuff that Kennedy was trying to stop. And remember, Kennedy gets removed. Why? Caddy says because Kennedy wanted to share the UFO file, or some of that aspect with his Soviet counterparts. Kennedy essentially wanted to do a peaceful scientific mission to the moon with the Russians. This was later confirmed by Gorbachev's son. But Douglas Caddy was the one that basically represented these Watergate burglars. So let's just get some images of them all together, shall we? Yeah, this is them here. And so how is that link, right? The Douglas Caddy that represents these guys for a time in the prosecutor's seat is the same person that hears later the reason for JFK's extinction, basically, from this world. And we heard that from Howard Hunt, who was one of the people indicted by grand jury. So we're starting to see how this bubble and trouble is stirring the American people into wars that they don't want, into policies that they are unaware of. And where does all of this sound familiar? You can kind of very much pinpoint that back to what we are finding in today's day and age. So it's an interesting prospect to keep in mind, all of this. So these are the Watergate burglars. This is the Watergate scandal. This is Nixon basically getting taken down by his own lies and his own contempt for the laws and the procedures of just the people's nation, built by order, justice, and the principles of democracy in an open, free society. It's a complete antithesis to that, right? And so the Nixon resignation was really a massive televised and broadcast event. And what's very interesting is that the other person that dodged a bullet in this whole thing was George Bush Sr., head of the CIA at the time. How he'd managed to dodge this bullet was amazing. Now, what's interesting is that Nixon gets pardoned by the following American president. I believe it was President Ford. So it's funny that later on, some of the people that George Bush pardons are some of the people that were involved in the Watergate scandal. So let's just have a look here. This is the Ford gives pardon to Nixon, who regrets my mistake. Yeah, mistake is an understatement. So I was gonna throw some profanity about there, but I'll restrain myself. And then, as I said, George Bush also pardons a bunch of people. And here, let's see if we can get. So this is shortly after the announcement from former President Nixon. Sorry, let me try again. This is the Ford pardon of Nixon. That's not what I wanted to see. Let's read this from Rolling Stone, shall we? and under Barack, George Bush commutes sentences. Bill Clinton, Iran-Contra Affair. Here we go. Bush pardons 6 men in the Iran-Contra Affair, including Weinberg and... Oh, so it was from the Iran-Contra, my apologies. Oh, no, here we go. Ronald Reagan pardons FBI officials Mark Felt. Mark Felt was the Deep Throat... so Deep Throat was his cover during the Watergate scandal. Basically, Mark Felt was giving Woodward and Bernstein these leaks that kept incriminating Nixon till eventually he was deposed. And so yeah, it's interesting. He got a pardon, which is pretty cool. So anyway, sorry, my apologies. It was Bush that was pardoning people from the Iran-Contra affair, and I think that's where we're going to start to close up on this version of Storytime here. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the final part of our story, of our episode 10 Storytime. We're talking about the deep state and secrecy here, because when we look at things like the Durham Report, when we look at things like Watergate, and now we're going to look at the Iran-Contra affair, we'll see that again, involved there are great forces that are clandestine, illegal, and greatly affecting the American people and the peacefulness of the world. And what gets called out by the Iran-Contra affair is again this insidious mix of politics and intelligence to basically subvert the ends of justice and to lie and misinform and misdirect the elected officials and the public. So the Iran-Contra affair, let's just pull this up on Wikipedia here. So according to Wikipedia, it was also known as the McFarlane affair in Iran. So the Iran-Contra was a political scandal in the United States that occurred during the second term of the Reagan administration. Senior administration officials secretly facilitated the sale of arms to Iran, which was the subject of an arms embargo at the time. Now, what I want to say about that arms embargo is this is terribly embarrassing at the time for America, right? Because this is like the 1980s, and they are trying to prop up Saddam Hussein against Iran, and at the same time make sure that Iran is not able to access markets and the components that they need to defend themselves against Iraq. So the Iran-Contra is so embarrassing to the Americans because they basically had this Operation Staunch, which went around trying to get all the states of the world to agree to put a kind of sanctions on Iran, and then they find out that the people violating these very sanctions are the Americans. So it was a great diplomatic embarrassment for them at the time. But let's go a little bit further. So basically the selling of these arms to Iran, which was during an embargo, hoped to produce money that could be used to fund the Contras. And these Contras were US-backed rebel groups, and they were in opposition of the Sandinistas. And this was, again, the coup that happened in Nicaragua and in, again, other parts of Latin America, or, South America. So basically, here they are violating an embargo, an international embargo. So in the public, they're like, embargo Iran, but secretly they're selling them weapons. And then not only that, but they're using some of that money to filter that to rebels to go overthrow democratically elected presidents. Now, whether good or bad, that's up for debate, but the people should make up their own minds and not be flooded with weapons and training from the CIA to kind of follow American political interests. And again, I'm picking on America here, but any superpower is doing the same thing. This is why we have to be wise to these kinds of strategies that they use. So, looking further into the Iran-Contra, I erroneously earlier said that George W. Bush was the head of the CIA at the time under Nixon, and that was incredibly incorrect. Sorry, it was under Reagan. And here you can see that many people were indicted, but one of the people that wasn't was President George H.W. Bush. Okay, so Bush Sr., who was vice president at the time. And he was obviously former head of the CIA as well. And as we know from StoryTime, the Bush family goes way back to the formation of the military-industrial complex. And Bush Senior was the one that Vannevar Bush, he was the one who, along with Trump's uncle, went and seized the papers and in the safe of Nikola Tesla when he passed away in his New York apartment. So as you can see, this unbroken chain of Bushes being highly involved in secret activities at the highest levels, even beyond that of the normal functioning of the state, is quite telling. And you can see that Bush wasn't indicted this time around, but it even says here in Wikipedia, the rest of those indicted or convicted were all pardoned in the final days of the presidency of George H.W. Bush, who had been vice president at the time of the affair. So think about it. At the time of this Iran-Contra thing, he says he doesn't know anything, he doesn't get indicted, but when he eventually becomes president, he pardons all of them. And those pardons are to people that, again, were ex-CIA, ex-military, intelligence. So that goes to show, it goes on further to say here, former independent counsel Walsh noted that in issuing the pardons, Bush appeared to have been preempting being implicated himself by evidence that came to light during the Weinberger trial, and noted that there was a pattern of deception and obstruction by Bush, Weinberger, and other senior Reagan administration officials. Sorry, my apologies. Let me read that one more time. So it was that evidence came to light during the Weinberger trial and noted that there was a pattern of deception and obstruction, not only by Bush, Weinberger, but other senior Reagan administration officials. Walsh submitted in his final reports in 1993 and later wrote an account of his experiences as counsel, and that you can find in Firewall, the Iran-Contra Conspiracy and Cover-Up. So, as I said, this is going deep into the CIA secret war that America is fighting against not only South America, but there's also a state of tension in Europe, and bases being built everywhere, and great tensions as Castro is now cozying up to the Soviet Union in this time and period. But this doesn't excuse the corridors of power abusing their mandate and going outside of the law to try and, because the official statement in the Iran-Contra, the official story, is that the money was given to Israel, and Israel gave the, through Perez and intelligence connections, they were the ones that gave the weapons to Iran in exchange for hostages. And so it was all above board. But, as you can read through much of the research that's been done, none of that actually holds water. This was a big cover-up. and an interesting way that we start to see how the black budget is funded, whether through Pablo Escobar running cocaine across the border, or the Iran-Contra selling weapons to the enemy so that they can, channel funds that aren't seen by Congress to rebels in South America. It's a big mess. And here, obviously Reagan was very sick during this time. He had cancer and stuff, and eventually the reports kind of the commissions said that he didn't really know about the activities unfolding. But then again, Nixon said the same thing. So Reagan didn't get as big a brunt as Nixon did. There wasn't that smoking gun, and there wasn't this public flagration that happened afterwards with Reagan as with Nixon. But Reagan still suffered politically and wasn't able to continue his run as president because of this huge scandal that was the Iran-Contra. Now, I just want to point out that, whether we're looking at Watergate or the Iran-Contra or the Pentagon Papers that show lies to Congress about the scope of the Vietnam War that was given to us by Ellsberg. Ellsberg was going to be tried for treason, and he was eventually pardoned and all of that. But if it wasn't for a leaker, we would never know. If Officer Mills hadn't found the burglars at the DNC Watergate complex, we would probably never know about all the insidious political corruption of Nixon. And so these little things just are enough sometimes to break the dam of truth and bring forward the information that we need. But I also want to just remind everyone that, Seymour Hersh was also writing very important articles about, again, the lies that the military try keep from us and try keep from elected officials and try keep from the courts. You can't use the topic of national security to run rampant and do whatever you choose. And as I said, that with the political scandals of Watergate and with the Iran-Contra affair, both presidents said, I didn't really have anything to do with this. These agencies kind of, misconstrued my words and ran off and started their own operations, unbeknownst to even myself. And there might be a little grain of truth in that, but if we look at it in a sober fashion, we can see that the levels of corruption usually go higher than the people that get into trouble. And in most countries, you will see that only you get to the president only once a really long line of people have eventually come first in some form of prosecution. Now, this is where we're going to wrap up StoryTime 10. We're pointing out the scandals of the Durham Reports, Watergate, Pentagon Papers, Iran-Contra Affair, and just all these things as an example of this deep state function. As I said, or not as I said, but as Dr. Peter Dale Scott very succinctly mentions to us, the deep state doesn't have a very clear definition. It's a gaseous group of unelected decision makers that are unaccountable, and that's why they abuse their power. There's no checks and balances. And these examples, like the Durham Report, Watergate, Pentagon Papers, Iran-Contra, are almost analogues of the same corrupt problem. And as you see with the Durham Report, the suggestion is, don't disband the FBI, don't take it much further. I must admit, the Durham Report was very damning. Even CNN had to admit that, this appears to vindicate Trump to some degree. They never want to admit the loss, but it is groundbreaking and it is earth sort of shattering in a way. But Peter Dale Scott giving us this great outline of what this beast called the deep state is. And again, you can't really call it a state because it's not really very organized like it is. There's not checks and balances and part of the society that derives it. That derives its existence. But let's call it this the deep political strata that runs around unchecked, committing all kinds of crime. We see this in these reports, we see this in the commissions, we see this in the scandals, we see this in the testimony and whistleblowers and the leakers. And thank goodness that we do eventually get access to this information, because when we look at the Durham Report today, if we didn't have Watergate and we didn't have the Iran-Contra affair to reference, like, what was the FBI doing? What was the CIA doing? Why were they doing it? How were they doing it? How was it being funded? How was it connected to other illegal activity? And why are these players showing up in different operations, let's call it? We wouldn't have a clear picture of this. And so we're fortunate that today, when we look at the Durham Report, we can reference back to things like Watergate and the Iran-Contra, and really just keep in a very clear focus this concept of what is the deep state, what are these forces that at their very apex, at their very at their most, let's say, pumped up version, at their most developed, in their most developed form, this deep state runs itself to continuation of government, advanced aerospace, and special access secrets. And this continuation of government thing, as I say, is a bit of a doomsday cult. That's what we kind of looked at a little bit in the previous story time. It's a doomsday cult because they're planning for the worst, and they're the ones that are instigating these problems and these conflicts, and doing so, as I said, not with the collaboration and full knowledge of the people that actually put them in power and pay their salaries. Instead, it's completely subversive. So I hope this kind of makes this picture clearer for you guys as you contemplate some of the names and the things that we've spoken about this evening. But I'm always thankful that, you know, although we have fun with story time, there's often something real that happens to us in modern day times. And when we look back at some of the crazy, you know, call it conspiracy theory if you want, much of this is proven research. So, you know, it's no longer very conspiratorial at all. But we can start to see the links and track this deep state activity and the deep events that it's causing us through 9/11 and COVID and now the Durham Report. You know, these things shake the foundation of our freedoms and our belief in institutions. We were talking about constitutional crisis earlier. So this is why the government is not your friend. This is why the intelligence services are not there to help you, and why we shouldn't expect truth and sort of utopian collaboration from them. We need to fend for ourselves as people. That means, you know, keeping your friends and family and your community as close to you as possible and developing it there from the inside out. The rot has gotten so far ahead that we have to sort of take it back a level, and people have to start as I said, there's the overworld where we all reside, and then this insidious underworld. And things like the Durham Report show that things have not gotten better. The institutions are still corrupt and are still abusing the rights and privileges and freedoms given to them by the people and the law. So I hope this has become a little bit clearer from wherever you find yourself in the world. It's a bit of a late night stream that we've had this evening. We've run for 2 hours. Thank you so much for joining us. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to drop them either in our live chat or we're going to be posting this up on YouTube at the Prime Matter Podcast. You can also email us, primematterpodcast@gmail.com. And especially if you have information or you want to touch on topics in the future, we'll be joining you next Sunday if the electricity allows. The joys of being in Africa. Wouldn't be anywhere else, but let me just say that there are some technical challenges here and there. But it has been my pleasure to host you guys this evening from my little corner of the world, and to try and find a little bit of a deeper understanding about where we are. You know, when we look at the news today and we think back on Watergate and the Iran-Contras and CIA, FBI, NSA, alphabet soup of just unelected officials and deep state operatives that are challenging the things that actually make society healthy, it's important to kind of contemplate that all. And it's nice that we had fun with it. I really did. So please enjoy and have a look at this podcast. It'll be put up on YouTube if you want to have a listen to it again. And we'll see you at the next meeting on Sunday coming up. And we'll be following on a lot of these topics. As I mentioned in Storytime 9, there is a very deep consciousness and spirituality dynamic and dimension that kind of comes into this whole story. So we'll definitely be getting back to that. But the Durham Report was a groundbreaking example in modern times that we really needed to look at in this particular story time. So Storytime 10 comes to an end, but it's just a circle of which we will come back to in Storytime 11 on Sunday. So please join us then. We'll post the times a little bit closer to the event. And again, just thank you to everyone for having joined us. It was a great pleasure, and fantastic to see everyone with the questions and comments. I really enjoy the feedback, so please be sure to send that in. And just fantastic to have just wonderful people bring really interesting conversation to the fore. It really becomes a part of some of the story time that I share with you. So as I say, I've been monologuing for 2 hours, but it's a dialectic and it's a dialogue. I love sharing this kind of information with you, and we have fun with it here at Storytime. So have a good remainder to the rest of your week. We'll catch you in a few days. And in that meantime, we'll be gaming, we'll be chilling as we do. Have yourselves a fantastic one, ladies and gentlemen. This is Euphoria, streaming out and catching you next time. Peace.